Hi, I'm Steve Yegge, and I'm a Googler. I've been here for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was at Amazon for about 7 years, and I was at GeoWorks for about 5 years before that, and I went to the University of Washington.
Cool. So recently, or maybe not even so recently, you had a blog post talking about a little thing you were planning with porting Rails to JavaScript.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. So it's called R&R, which stands for Rhino and Rails, and it's basically a port of Ruby on Rails minus active record, although we're probably going to do that too at some point. It's to JavaScript on the JVM. So it's kind of an unusual choice, but well, like I said in the blog post, we didn't have a lot of options for languages. We had to use Python or JavaScript, and it had to be on the JVM because of the back end that we were talking to. So, well, it was pretty much either Python or JavaScript. Now, why would I do something crazy like port Rails? Well, I'm not really a web developer. I don't know very much of that stuff. I don't know the HTTP protocol very well. I mean, I know it a little better now. I don't know much about DHTML. I mean, I'm not really a front-end guy, even though since I did this at Google, I've been kind of like pigeonholed as a front-end guy, and now I'm just like, I don't do front ends. But seriously, I didn't know it very well, but I did know that what we had was really painful, right? And it's kind of like universally acknowledged that it's painful. But I mean, most web frameworks are, right? Web programming is just hard. It just evolved like, in the mid-90s, right? There was this big arms race, and browsers were adding features, and it just was a mess, right? It wasn't standardized or anything. So we have DHTML, and so web frameworks have to kind of generate this. All they are is big code generators, right? And a lot of them don't do a very good job of it. And Google's internal ones, some people like them, but Google builds for scale, right? I mean, that's what Google is really, really, really good at. And every once in a while, you get into a situation where, there's a project that's got to iterate, before you show it to, 10 or 100 or 1,000 million users, right? You've got to you're going to try it out and do some user testing and whatever, and you can't have this, this infrastructure, this scale infrastructure when you're iterating, when you're innovating, right? And so, we wanted to use Rails. Our team wanted to use Rails. Our team of, 2 people, I think, got started back in September of 2006. But they had already kind of shot that idea down because it was going into production, and Rails really does have some scalability issues. They're working through it, but right now it's very hard to get Rails to scale. So we figured, well, how hard can it be to port it? So.
What about JRuby?
Yeah, JRuby's really cool, but I had used it and it was really slow 2 years ago. Now it's improved a lot, and there's JRuby on Rails and everything. But the problem is, even if JRuby were lightning fast, it's still Ruby, which means it's kind of a no-no at Google. Now I could see a situation, I mean, Google's no different from anywhere else, right? Everybody's got their standard languages that you can use. And there are good reasons for it, right? And there's a lot of infrastructure involved in supporting a language at any company. And so it makes sense not to have to tax the organization by adding in something, like Ruby just for a framework, right? But I could see something happening, right? The JVM is, its son's .NET, right? I mean, I know that's saying it backwards because .NET was a response to the JVM, but really, Sun is a little bit late to the game in sort of realizing that the JVM really ought to host multiple languages, right? Microsoft's way ahead of them on this, and has been for years. Because as soon as Microsoft realized that languages mattered, right, which that big lawsuit, way back in the 90s, kind of slapped them, and they were like, oh, languages matter. Well, they responded to it in Microsoft fashion, and they went and they hired a bunch of great languages researchers, guys that are just my heroes, right? And they've gone to town for 10 years on, supporting languages on .NET. And Sun was kind of like, after 7 years, they were like, oh, maybe we ought to do that too, right? Because they had a little bit of trouble divorcing kind of Java the language from Java the platform, right? As most developers do. So so then they hired the JRuby guys, and they bundled Rhino with the JDK, and they've been making a lot of strides in this direction. So what I could see happening is JRuby could actually become sort of accepted in the Java community worldwide, right? Not just inside of a given company or inside of Google or whatever. If it were bundled and it were supported and it were documented, and then there were a lot of marketing around it, right? Where Sun got behind it and said, yeah, Ruby's really good for, pick your favorite thing, web programming, where it's just a bunch of glue, right? If that happened, then, any critical mass of Java developers is going to say, well, we'll take a look at it, I guess, because all the other Java developers are looking at it, right? At which point it could happen. But it's like 3 years out. It's not viable inside of Google today, right? So even if it performed well, it's just not.
Cool. So JavaScript is very dynamic, but it doesn't have all of the meta programming stuff that Ruby does. How did that affect the port?
The biggest way that it affected it was Ruby's very object-oriented, right? I mean, it's a small talk kind of derivative, I guess, and it's got classes and it's got singletons and public, private, protected, and inheritance and all that stuff, right? Plus meta classes. A lot of support for OOP, and JavaScript has functions, right? Which, as you computer scientists know, is perfectly adequate, but still, if you want to do a direct port, see, my goal was I wanted you to be able to pick up a Rails book, there's like 50 of them now, right? And kind of read about it to learn the architecture, and then just do this syntactic transform to JavaScript, right? Because JavaScript was sort of blessed at Google. There's tools, there's support, there's whatever. It was a little bit of a reach to go from client-side JavaScript to server-side JavaScript, but amazingly, it flew. Right? People were like, yeah, that's true. There's no resistance at all. I was like, okay. It could have been Jython, right? And that was I tell you, I'm serious. Like 3 months into this port, even 3 months into it, I was just pulling my hair out, going, "This is not going to work. I made the wrong decision. I have to rewrite it all in Jython, right? Because I've used Jython. Jython's a great language, but I prevailed, and because JavaScript's really quirky, right? You've got to get over its quirks and stuff. So one of the things that we did to make Rails porting easier was we took the class system out of the Flanagan, O'Reilly book, the Rhino book, which is, it's like def class, right? Or define class. Define class is already a taken identifier in Rhino, so we call it def class. And I just put it on steroids. I added support for getters and setters, getter and setter inheritance, static fields, improved support for a whole host of things. Specifically because Rails uses controllers and models, right? And you want those things. The views not so much, but definitely controllers. You wanted to be able to have filter inheritance and all this stuff. And so to just make it a straight across port, I did a super uber define class, which we ought to really release as open source, but we're probably going to try to open source the whole thing, so it'll come along with it. And that helped, right? People who really know JavaScript now, they come in and they go, why'd you do that? You could just use prototypes. But if you look at what I had to do, the hoops I had to jump through to make this thing work, you'd just be like, oh, I get it now, right? Now, ECMA 4 is going to be introducing classes, and so it's not clear whether our def class is going to survive. We're upgrading Rhino to ECMAScript 4, right?
Cool.
We're serious about it. There's a whole team inside of Google that's contributing to it. We're going to be putting several people on it, and it should be done this year. Right? So we can talk about that a little bit later if you want.
Yeah, cool.
In any case, that was the big thing. Is Ruby's got all the metaprogramming meta classes, and mostly what we did is we layered an object system on top of that. And on top of that, JavaScript's really flexible, really flexible.
So the point in time that you did the port, it was you could probably pick up a book and the Rails book and start working with it. What about now with Rails 2.0 and all the millions of Rails plugins that are out there and all that kind of fun stuff?
Yeah, so we started porting, back in Rails 1.2 or something like that. And, now there's Rails 2, and it's got some incompatibilities, as I found out, because I did my own Rails site not too long ago at home. And, so we... it's a hard one. Do we want to make it... the right way to do this would actually, really the right way to do it would be to actually set up a standards committee, right? Even an impromptu one, and just say, you know what? Rails is officially, an unofficial standard, right? It's been ported to Perl, it's been ported to Python, it's been ported to Java, right? Everybody's kind of jumping on the Rails bandwagon as an architecture, not necessarily as, Ruby on Rails, right? Ruby on Rails is like the reference implementation. So we could actually set it up and say, well, let's agree to standardize on this sort of architecture, right? At which point, we'd pick whether it was 1.5 or 2.0, whatever, and then we'd come to it. That'd be the right way to do it. And do we have resources for that? Not really. It would be kind of an ad hoc. You know how it is, right?
Yeah.
I think we're going to start by open sourcing it, right? And that, I think, is going to be the biggest dependency we had inside of Google was the servlet engine that we're using, and that is getting open sourced, but its timeline is a little bit different from. We don't want to be dependent on it.
Yeah.
And so we're actually looking at Jetty now as
cool.
sort of a standard, Java-based open source servlet engine and container. It's pretty good, actually. It's nice. And so if we can just swap it out so that R&R can run on Jetty, then we should be able to open source it like this summer.
What about the active record side of things?
Yeah, we need a story there, right? I mean, one easy story is to say hibernate, right? Because, I mean, any Java library, any pure Java library that you want to use, you can use from R&R, right? You can use it from Rhino. It's trivially callable. So we could just say, yeah, use hibernate and wave our hands, right? It's a little hand wavy because hibernate is very powerful, and it could be used to host an active record, but it's not as plug and play and easy to just drop it in as active record, right? So we do have some people who are actually actively interested in porting active record or coming up with probably just porting it at this point.
Okay, because how much of the in theory 10x productivity gains is to do with bundling things like active record?
A lot of it is. We found at least half of it was the database side of it.
Okay. Cool. So there's a bunch of work in making it kind of decoupling it from Google before it could actually get open sourced.
Actually, it's funny. Java servlets. All it is it's an HTTP request that got broken apart, and then you've got some basically name value pairs, some form parameters, maybe some headers, right? And that's it. That's your whole dependency. We didn't actually wind up being dependent on any other Google infrastructure. So, the open sourcing of it is largely a resource issue, and we do have some full-time resources on this thing now. It's gaining some internal momentum. We're going to try to integrate it with GWT, which is another big Google offering, which has a sort of a very strong story for widgets, right? Where, Rails doesn't have widgets, right? We integrated a dialog from the Google internal JavaScript library, and that's it. We've got a dialog. It's nice, but you need lots of widgets. So we met with the GWT guys, and we think that there's sort of complementary technologies. Because Rails and R&R are really more like a servlet container, right? But very lightweight with lots of conventions. And so.
Cool. Were there any benefits that you saw out of having JavaScript kind of totals all the way up from the client-side browser to the server side? Like you probably don't need a RJS anymore and stuff like that.
It was a little, so Rails, I take it.
Yeah.
So RJS is a little wacky because at first I was like, wait a minute, so we're going to write JavaScript code that generates JavaScript code, so you have to write JavaScript code.
Exactly.
And I sort of gave up halfway through porting that, and then I realized later, well, the server-side JavaScript story is very different from the client-side one. It's one language, right? Whereas client-side JavaScript is just like Opera and Concur and IE and Firefox and different versions and right. And plus with server-side JavaScript we have more sort of power because we were able to hook into the JVM and add invisible non-enumerable methods to object and array and things like that. So it's a more Ruby-like environment, right? So you're actually writing in very powerful, consistent JavaScript to generate really crufty JavaScript. So in that sense, it kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
We haven't actually gone there yet, although we've played with it a little bit because, of course, you're typing in your editor and you want it knows JavaScript, right? And in Rails, you would embed JavaScript in strings, okay? Which is totally hokey because you're in JavaScript, you want your editor to kind of know. And so one guy on our team came up with this really clever templating system where you actually write your client-side JavaScript out using these dollar and name variables, serialize it to a string, since that's one thing that JavaScript can do really well that Ruby and Python don't, is take any code arbitrarily and serialize it out to a string. And then replace the variables and you're off and running. So we've got that problem solved. I thought you were going to ask, are there any advantages to Rhino just in general over, have I wound up regretting it? Yeah. And one thing I found, I think this is probably true for any JVM language, any scripting language. The one thing that just levels the playing field. It completely obliterates any of the downsides like of static typing or whatever, is unit testing. Right? Now a lot of developers are going to be like, oh yeah, unit testing, boring, right? But I'm serious, it is boring until you get into a scripting language like this and you realize how easy it is to stub out this giant legacy system, millions of lines of Java code, right? And it needs all this configuration, and you need to call one method in it, and all you need it to do is return null, right? Because it's a unit test, right? In Rhino, you literally it's just a couple lines of code, and it just says, oh yeah, I'm that legacy system, and I'm returning null now, and you're just like, ha, this is the way it should be. It's so nice that I think that R&R ought to be split. Right? It should be split into the sort of Rhino engine support, the language support we layered on top of Rhino. An improved debugger, an improved console, improved language facilities, a lot of built-in functions, right? Unit testing infrastructure. And then on top of that, we have all that Rails support, right? Models, views, controllers, filters, all that stuff, right? Should split it out so that you can take this layer and you can slap it into any Java application, and get dramatically improved unit testing. That would be really cool. I might do that this year. We'll see.
Cool. So is it a little bit tricky when your brain doesn't have to context switch anymore? You're in JavaScript.
Yeah.
But like you say, it's two different JavaScripts.
It is. It's a little tricky. It's not that bad. It trips you up occasionally, especially if it's an Ajax call where stuff's getting generated and going over and then coming back, and you're like, whoa. But, Ajax is a little bit complicated like that anyway, right? For the most part, we have found empirically, okay, that everybody who comes into R&R, they don't really know JavaScript. I didn't know JavaScript when I started, right? And there is a hurdle there. There's a lot of stuff you have to internalize, right? That's just like broken, right? And once you get past that's true for any language, right? I could go through all the things I had to internalize for Java that are broken that we just totally take for granted now, right? Once you're past that, then you got to kind of get to the point where you're sort of proficient with the language, right? It takes a couple months, and then you're like really comfortable with it. What we found is Java developers come in, they pick it up, and then pretty quickly, right, within like 2 months of using R&R, they turn over to the client-side JavaScript and they go, oh, it's just JavaScript. I know that, right? And then they go in and they just write this monster HTML stuff. And I'm like, make it a library. But, so it really does, it help more than it hurts.
So since you've got the JVM there, people also, some people just sneak back to Java land and start writing, can you write a whole controller in Java rather than JavaScript, for example?
That's a good question. Nobody has, and it's because the JavaScript really is really pretty easy, and you could write libraries in Java, but by and large people have found that Rhino is a 100% drop-in replacement for Java. Anything you can do in Java, including multiple level subclassing, and delegation techniques you can use, and not a lot of Java is syntax when it comes right down to it. The language itself is actually pretty simple. Right? I just went through the entire JVM specification over the weekend, read through all the bytecode for this other project that I'm doing. Right?
Even with all the generics and extends question mark and all that crazy stuff.
That's all kind of a workaround so that you don't have to cast everything, right? And even that was a fairly controversial move in the Java community. I went overnight from being a Java guru to somebody who doesn't know Java very well when that came out. And I think a lot of people went through that experience and they're just like, even years later, right? It messed with all the tools, all the Eclipse, all the Emacs, So you can say, generics is a huge step forward, but I went through a 500,000 line code base and it found 2 bugs in my code, right? When I added generics, right? And it didn't really compress the code. I don't know. So I'm not sold on it, right? Some people are. So even with generics taken into account, you can pretty much do anything you want in JavaScript. So people haven't fallen back to Java. Good question, though.
Yeah, very cool. So, how's Rhino these days? What kind of what state is it in? How production worthy is it? I'm sure that you obviously think it is.
So Rhino is a great piece of software, and now I'm coming to realize how much better it could be. But it's definitely the most polished JVM language implementation out there outside of Java. I've been through all of them. I've been in the guts of Jython. I haven't looked at JRuby lately. They've been doing a lot of work on that, so maybe JRuby. Groovy. I've been through Groovy. I've been through all these ones you've never heard of, like Netrex and Peanuts, and Scala's really nice too. If you like that, if you like the Hindley-Milner type system, which 0.00056% of all programmers really love that type of system. But
concurrency, parallel programming.
Yeah, so Rhino actually, Brendan Eich, doesn't like threads, right? Over his dead body kind of thing. So JavaScript has no thread support, but Rhino has a very well-defined thread story, right? It is fundamentally multi-threaded, the way they set it up, and so we haven't had any trouble at all. That's I would say that of the 3 or 4 really big advantages we have over Rails, one of them is concurrency, right? We can host a lot of requests in one box, and trust me, I've been through with Zed Shaw's Mongrel, and I've run all the different fast CGI, slow CGI, and SCGI, and they're all really difficult to make Rails handle a lot of requests on one box. And we basically can handle, however many, the underlying servlet engine can. It's using, the new IO libraries, and, a couple hundred, at least a couple hundred requests, per second. But it's got to be more than that. We haven't measured it lately. And I know Rails can kind of achieve that, but it takes work, where you just get it out of the box with our stuff, right? Yeah. So.
Cool.
Rhino's really cool. Rhino, I mean, I'm working with Norris Boyd, the author of Rhino, on writing a book on it. We're working on upgrading it. It could be better. It could have a better console. It could have a better debugger. We might integrate some of those from R&R into Rhino. You know.
Are there things that are different in Rhino than in SpiderMonkey and like little nits or?
Yeah, there are
Pretty close.
some things that the JVM can't support fundamentally, right? Like, so for example, SpiderMonkey has continuations, and Rhino only has continuations in interpreted mode, but not in when you generate Java bytecode. JavaScript has the ability to get the caller. You can just say arguments.caller, and you can get your caller, right? So you could like grub around in a stack frame, or you could, you know, and there's, obviously that's not something you want to do in programming in the large, but there are certain situations where you really could use it. And in Java, you tend to hack that actually by like serializing a throwable and looking at this, you know, or there's actually an API for it now, right? You can actually look at the stack frames, you know, to get, you know, information about who's calling you. And you can't do it the way JavaScript does it in the JVM, so it's just not there, right? But most of the differences are pretty minor.
Cool. So you mentioned GWT before. It's kind of funny to compare the GWT approach of write it all in Java and generate JavaScript versus write it all in JavaScript.
Right. And, you know, we used to joke about it, but it pretty quickly, you know, actually became clear that, okay, so maybe there's not many people that are firmly hold this opinion yet, but I think it's going to become more widespread, which is that if you actually wrote your GWT programs in something like R&R, you know, using Rhino, then you would get actually the benefits from both sides, okay? The idea of generating JavaScript, whether you do it in Java or Haskell or whatever language, okay, is a fine idea, given that there's so many conflicting implementations of it, right? You know, there are also people who are trying to solve it with libraries that kind of smooth out their differences, but you're going to get better performance if you can generate custom, you know, so GWT performs really well, right? So fundamentally, it's a really good idea. But GWT doesn't really have, as far as I can tell, it doesn't really have a story for the server side. It's just whatever servlet container you happen to be using, right? And that's actually the story that Rails, right, and R&R and all other Rails clones are actually addressing. Okay, so you can actually marry the two together, and you can have GWT do all of your widget programming and not have to worry with the ugliness of client-side JavaScript, and you can do it in server-side JavaScript. It's totally ironic. It's not what you would expect, but we think it can work pretty well.
Cool. So my biggest pain when I do Ajax apps these days is actually to do with CSS and that kind of world, not to do with the JavaScript world. So how can tools like this maybe help people actually do decent layouts and things like that that you have absolute agony over these days?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, maybe the answer is you wait for everybody to upgrade to IE 7 or IE 8, and then CSS works kind of the way it's supposed to across browsers. You know, maybe the answer is a meta language that kind of, you know, unifies, you know, the JavaScript and the CSS. I don't know the answer. You know, I mean, what I do know is that CSS is very, very powerful as long as you're only targeting exactly one browser, right? Because then you can go wild, if something doesn't work, you tweak it, and it'll look like terrible in any other browser, which is a problem. You know, and there are plenty of people who've argued that we just need a completely new language for the web. You know, I mean, maybe we don't even want to necessarily write, you know, JavaScript and CSS and, you know, server-side languages and, you know, HTML and XML and, you know, I mean, maybe we just want one language. And of course, all the Lisp, you know, all the 5 Lisp people out there, Lisp, right? You know, I don't know the answer to that question.
Cool.
It's a hard one.
So you're a language geek. What new cool language would you like to play with next?
Next? Oh boy. There's some good ones that I would like to dig into. Actually, to be honest, I really wish I knew more about D. I've programmed in the D language, and it's delightful. It was quite expressive. It was actually, I did a bunch of programs that I kind of ported from Ruby scripts that I had written, and I swear it was like only about 20% like larger than the Ruby code. I mean, it's super tight, except it's just lightning fast. It's like C++ fast or faster. And Walter Bright, you know, he like lives here in Kirkland and comes and has lunch with all the language geeks here, right? And we talk to him, we say, Walter, you need to learn marketing. And he's like, yeah, I know. So he's getting it, you know. But it could be, if it were link compatible with C++, which is hard, but if it were, then it could be used, right, with all of your existing C++ libraries.
Yeah.
So it could be a replacement. It could be the long-awaited replacement for C++, right?
Yeah.
You know, that Java never really shaped up to be. It wound up being sort of a different playing field. That would be really cool.
Because yeah, the pain is always in the libraries, right? You can have this great new language, but you've got all these libraries laying around.
That's right. And it's link compatible with C, But the name mangling and stuff, makes it tricky. So I don't know. I'm leaning on Walter to try to prioritize that. And, he's written like Zortex, C++, and like lots of C++ compilers. He knows his stuff. He just doesn't want to pollute his poor D, but he needs to.
Cool. Great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.